We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast, everyone. It is January 24th, 6 a.m. Just got off work, had some dinner. Well, breakfast for you all, dinner for me. Pretty chill night, small truck. Trucks are getting slimmer. I've warned everybody that shortages are on the way. I warn you again. I don't see me going in for overtime tomorrow because everything's all caught up. But here I am podcasting and kind of getting a little tired of reporting on just like news and the beer bug and all that. So I want to kind of go back into my older style of podcasting and get into different conspiracies each episode and stuff like that. Fun subjects. So today we're covering a subject I have not covered yet, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's get on with the show. The world they left behind. In 68 CE, the members of an apocalyptic Jewish sect abruptly fled the settlement of Qumran in the Dead Sea Desert, leaving their library of scrolls hidden in surrounding caves. Why? We can't be sure. They may have been fleeing marauding Romans, but nearly 2,000 years later the scrolls were unearthed after a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into one of the caves. The greatest archaeological discovery of modern times had begun, and so had the bizarre odyssey of the scrolls. Over time, the priceless scrolls and fragments were hung on wash lines, buried in backyards, illegally peddled in Jerusalem markets, shipped in luggage to New Jersey, put up for sale in the Wall Street Journal, flown on DC-6s, sealed in Beirut vaults, hidden under floorboards, damaged by mold, and simply forgotten between pages of books. Some of the jars the scrolls were found in ended up as water containers in Bethlehem. Many treasures likely fell into private hands or were lost forever. Even the scrolls we know about are often inscrutable, with much information, including a key to elusive buried treasure, written in code, or using terms that we can't understand. Still, they provide enough information to suggest that the sect at Qumran was the Essenes, a theory accepted by most mainstream scholars and reflected throughout. Believing that other Jews had lost their way, the Essenes expected to survive the imminent end of the world in a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. That war never arrived, but the Romans probably did, destroying the community on their way to ransack Jerusalem. Whatever happened to the people of the scrolls, none of them could have predicted that their parchments would resurface in the late 1940s to surprise and enlighten a still surviving world. The mystery begins. A Bedouin shepherd's idol rock toss leads to one of the greatest archaeological finds in history. On November 29, 1947, Eleazar L. Zukanik, an archaeology professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, rode a bus into Bethlehem's Arab quarter, to see Syrian Christian antiquities dealer Fidhi Salahi about some ancient scrolls. The tension in the bus was palpable. Although he had an escort, an Armenian dealer known only as Mr. X, Sukenik was the only Jew on board. Days before, with a barbed wire fence between them, Mr. X had shown Sukenik a leather fragment of an ancient document. Mr. X was in Arab-controlled area of Jerusalem known as Military Zone B, that Sukenik, as a Jew, wasn't authorized to enter. When the scholar expressed interest in the item, Mr. X told him he had more fragments in his shop. Better still, his friend Salahi had 3 actual scrolls. There was just one problem. Salahi lived in an Arab-controlled Bethlehem. The League of Nations British Mandate of July 1992 had given the Crown control over parts of the Ottoman Empire that included what is now Israel, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Jordan. Since 1929, Jews and Arabs had fought openly in Palestine. Though Britain had tried to appease the Arabs by limiting Jewish immigration, after the U.S. sided with the Jews in 1945, the issue was turned over to the United Nations. Now in 1947, the UN's General Assembly debated the Partition of Palestine, which would divide the land between Arab and Israeli control. Tensions between Arabs and Jews were at an all-time high, and sniper fire filled the streets. Sukenik was risking his life by traveling into Bethlehem, but it proved worth the risk. In Salahi's apartment near the souk, or marketplace, the dealer handed his scrolls to the professor, whose hands trembled as he unwrapped them. He was astonished to discover that they were written in biblical Hebrew. The language was like that of Psalms, Sukenik later wrote, but the text was unknown to me. I looked and looked, and I suddenly had the feeling that I was privileged by destiny to gaze upon Hebrew scroll, which had not been read for more than 2,000 years. And it all began because Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave. In late 1946 or early 1947, the exact date is uncertain, and the tale changes with the teller. 3 Bedouin shepherds of the Ta'amara tribe were tending herds of goats and sheep among the limestone cliffs near Ain Feshka, a nature reserve on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The men, cousins Khalil Musa, Juma Muhammad Khalil, and Muhammad Ahmed El Hamed, nicknamed Ed Deeb, had stumbled upon an archaeological treasures in the region before, and Juma, for one, was always hoping that he would find gold. Late that afternoon, he threw a stone into one of 2 of the holes he saw on the cliff over the plain, a random act that would soon change history. When the stone landed inside the cave, Juma heard something shatter. Was this a vessel containing treasure? Had he found gold at last? It was too late to explore further that night, but 2 days later, 15-year-old Ed Deeb returned to the cave alone, where he discovered 10 jars along the walls. 8 were empty, 1 was filled with nothing but earth, but the 10th contained a roll of leather and 3 scrolls wrapped in cloth. The greatest archaeological adventure in history had begun. After hanging the scrolls from a tent pole, where at least one was irrevocably damaged, the Bedouins sold the 4 documents to Khalil Eskander Sahin, a Bethlehem antiques dealer known as Kando. Before long, they ended up in the hands of Metropolitan Mar Samuel. Metropolitan is an ecclesiastical title like bishop, the head of St. Mark's Syrian Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem's Old City, who eventually bought them for the equivalent of only $100. Soon afterward, according to one Bedouin, 4 more scrolls were taken again with Kando, while the Bedouins sold 3, along with 2 jars to Salahi for $28.35. That's when Zukanik entered the picture. Having bought the scrolls from Zalahi, the professor was examining them in his Jerusalem home when his youngest son, Mati, announced that the UN had indeed voted to partition Palestine. In other words, when the British mandate officially ended on May 14, 1948, the first Jewish state in 2,000 years would be created. I could not remain indoors, wrote the scholar, who rushed outside to join the celebrations in the street, telling everyone he could about the scrolls. I do not know whether they believed me or even whether they heard what I was saying, but in the turbulent, emotional joy of that night, and sensing that I was transmitting something exciting, they responded with unrestrained delight. But the Arabs attacked the next day. A civil war had begun. The following month, Zukanik learned about the 4 other scrolls that were with Metropolitan Samuel at St. Mark's. Visiting the monastery, he saw that they were similar to the documents he'd bought from Salahi. So he offered the equivalent of about $2,000. Of course, that sum now seems absurdly low, but it was significantly higher than what had been paid before, prompting the Syrians to wonder how much the scrolls were actually worth. So they decided to consult the scholars at Jerusalem's American Schools of Oriental Research, ASOR for short. Samuel's assistant, Father Bertrus Salmi, made the call. Someone wants to know about some ancient Hebrew manuscripts, an Arab cook, Omar, told ASOR. Father Somi introduced himself and promptly began to lie. The monastery, he said, had found some old scrolls that had been in their collection of rare books for 40 years and needed information about them for the catalog. Could Trevor take a look? Well, of course. The next day, the priest arrived at Asor with his brother, carrying a leather satchel containing what they thought were 4 manuscripts. The 5th could not be unrolled and was left behind. One document in particular intrigued Trevor. It was larger than the others, cream-colored, and made of soft leather. I had expected the identification to be easy, the scholar later wrote, but this scroll was different. For one thing, its script reminded him of Nash Papyrus, the oldest biblical manuscript then known, dating from the 2nd century BCE and including the 10 Commandments. Of course, Trevor wanted to photograph the scroll, but he didn't have his camera handy, so he asked Salmi if he could copy a few lines by hand. The priest agreed. For what followed was straight out of the Da Vinci Code. After Salmi left the school, Trevor examined the text that he had copied and found the ancient Hebrew construction lul, L-L-W, meaning by not, repeated twice. In his Hebrew dictionary, he searched for instances of the odd form in the Hebrew Bible. It appeared twice in Chronicles books, twice in Amos, and twice in Isaiah. Consulting his Bible, Trevor learned that the 2 instances of lul in Chronicles revealed no similarity to the context copied from the manuscript, he later wrote. A reference to Amos 6:13 proved equally futile. But the book of Isaiah was a different story, literally. Verse 1 of chapter 65 reads, I am sought of them that asked not for me. I am found of them that sought me not. The pattern was a word for word and almost letter for letter exactly what I had copied from the manuscript, Trevor wrote. The astonished scholar could scarcely believe that the scroll he had just seen was previously unknown copy of the Hebrew book that had prophesied the coming of the Messiah and the imminent end of the world. Cracking the Bible code. The astounding scrolls had been found, but what do they mean? Behold me, unto a nation that was not called by my name, begins chapter 65 of the book of Isaiah. I have spread out my hands all the day unto a rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good. after their own thoughts, a people that provoketh me to anger continually to my face, that sacrificeth in gardens and burneth incense upon altars of brick. God in this passage was speaking to the Jews of the 6th century BCE, who had, he felt, lost their way. Ever since the time of Abraham in 1812 BCE, Jewish history has been defined by both rootlessness and the promise of home. Despite centuries of persecution, the Jews believed that they were in their God's chosen people, a status defined by His covenant, a divine promise of devotion and protection. It was reflected in the people's exodus from slavery in Egypt until under Moses and the parting of the Red Seas in 1312 BCE, the conquest of the Promised Land in 1272 BCE, and the days of King David and his son Solomon in the 8th century BCE. The signal achievement of the Davidic era was Solomon's construction of Jerusalem's first temple between 970 and 931 BCE, located on Mount Moriah. The structure was designed to hold the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-plated box that Moses had built to protect the Ten Commandments. But after Solomon's death, internecine strife led to the division of the land into the northern kingdom, Israel, and the mountainous southern kingdom of Judah, whose capital was Jerusalem. Both kingdoms would eventually fall to foreign invasion between 722 and 721 BCE. The northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians more than a century later. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar invaded the south, destroying Solomon's temple and relocating the city's most prominent Jews to Babylon. The so-called Babylonian captivity that followed led to a crisis of faith as Jewish leaders struggled to understand why they had been abandoned by their God. Eventually, they came to believe that God had not, in fact, broken His promise, but they had broken theirs, becoming Isaiah's rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good. The first book in the Hebrew Bible to reflect this theological shift, Isaiah, formed the basis of Christianity and later Islam. The New Testament Gospels writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, drew extensively on the book, which reads in part, "Behold, a young virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be Emmanuel," referring to the Anointed One, otherwise known as the Messiah. Centuries later, he would be called Jesus Christ. Ever since the age of 12, John Trevor had been an enthusiastic amateur photographer. By 1948, he had become a particularly accomplished one, so he set out to photograph the monastery's scrolls, partly because he wanted to show them to William F. Albright, an American archaeologist and professor at Johns Hopkins University. As one of the world's leading Middle East scholars, Albright would be able to verify the scrolls' antiquity. But photographing the documents proved a painstaking, time-consuming process that involved finding film, cultivating the goodwill of the Syrians, and dealing with frequent power outages in the war-torn region. The Syrians at St. Mark's gave Trevor and his colleague William Brownlee a single day, February 21st, 1948, to photograph the scrolls. This would have been a challenge under any circumstance, let alone without light, and there was no electrical power as they set up. We were alarmed by the fact that there was no electricity as yet, so we were prepared for either eventuality, Brownlee said, to use daylight or to work more conveniently under electric floodlights. Just as they were about to begin photographing, the electricity came on. Was someone telling them something? Was it God, perhaps? By day's end, Trevor and Brownlee had finished shooting both the Great Isaiah Scroll and a smaller, unidentified document composed of two stitched-together leather straps, then known as Jerusalem Scroll No. 2. But 2 further manuscripts remained unphotographed. At least, Trevor thought that they were 2 manuscripts. At 6:24 the next morning, truck bombs exploded on Jerusalem's Ben Yehuda Street, reportedly killing 49 people, but Trevor kept working, and it wasn't long before he made a striking discovery. As he prepared to photograph the final 2 scrolls, he realized that they were 2 halves of a single document. But what exactly was it? Using a magnifying glass to examine some of the text, Trevor found certain words translated as evil, doers of good, to do truth and righteousness and justice, that reminded him of biblical wisdom literature, a genre that offers insight, often in the form of sayings. Think Proverbs. But identification of the manuscript, now known as the Jerusalem Scroll 1, remained elusive until March, when Trevor and his colleagues focused on its frequently repeated noun, Yahad, which had no biblical equivalent, variously translated as community or communion. The noun seemed to indicate that the scroll was not specifically devoted to spiritual matters. Instead, it seemed to reflect the laws and standards of an aesthetic, apocalyptic Jewish sect. It was eventually dubbed the Community Rule. Trevor was now smack dab in the center of one of the greatest historical discoveries of the 20th century. But the American consul was urging all the Azor scholars to leave the increasingly embattled area. The Syrians, on the other hand, wanted Trevor to stay. But why? "We have been keeping something from you, Dr. John," Father Salmi said on March 5th, explaining that, far from languishing in the monastery's library for 40 years, the scrolls had been recently found in the cave on the shores of the Dead Sea. In August, he added, the Bedouins had taken one of the monastery's priests, Father Yusuf, back to the site, where they had found further fragments, jars, and cloth wrapping. In the process, fragments of cloth had been discarded, and 2 artifacts from the cave were being used as, of all things, water jars in Bethlehem. Time, Trevor later wrote, was running out. "My heartiest congratulations on the greatest MS discovery of modern times," William Albright wrote Trevor on March 15th, responding to the photos he had sent of the scrolls. "There is no doubt whether in my mind that the script is more archaic than that of Nash Papyrus. What an absolutely incredible find." 7 scrolls were now known to exist, including the Isaiah, the Community Rule, the Jerusalem Scroll, number 2. In February, the latter had been identified as a commentary on Habakkuk, a biblical book that, like Isaiah, reflected both the Babylonian captivity's crisis of faith and the expectation of the imminent arrival of the Messiah and the end of the world. When it was finally unwrapped, the so-called 4th scroll was revealed as the Genesis Apocryphon, an elaboration of the first book of the Bible, including an expanded version of the Noah story. Zucchinic scrolls would be identified as Isaiah B, an incomplete second copy of the seminal book, the Thanksgiving Hymn Scroll, similar to the Book of Psalms, and the War Scroll, aka War of the Children of Light, an apocalyptic depiction of a 40-year battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The War Scroll promised a time of salvation for the people of God and of everlasting destruction for the company of Belial. Still more treasures were waiting in the cave. Samuel, for one, believed that King Solomon's lost Ark of the Covenant was among them. But as civil war consumed the region, travel to the site was becoming increasingly dangerous. In April, Trevor and his fellow scholars fled the country. "We hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel," David Ben-Gurion, soon to be the nation's first prime minister, proudly announced at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art on May 14, 1948, the official end of the British Mandate. But even as he spoke, gunfire between Arabs and Jews rang out in the distance. 4 hours later, Egypt bombed Tel Aviv. The following day, Father Salmi was killed by shrapnel in the monastery's courtyard. Zukanik's youngest son Mati would have been killed too. The Arab-Israeli war had begun. Brokered by the UN, a first truce lasted from June 11th to July 9th. In August, after travel restrictions were loosened during the second truce, Samuel sent Father Yusuf and another guide back to the cave. They did not find the Ark of the Covenant. Instead, they unearthed further fragments that were later revealed as portions of the book of Daniel, the prime example of the apocalyptic literature in the Hebrew Bible. According to Herschel Shanks, author of The Mystery and Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that September, news of the scrolls finally reached the French Dominion priest Roland de Val, director of Jerusalem's École Biblique et Archéologique Française, and his colleague G. Lancaster Harding, the curator of the Department of Antiquities of Jordan. Harding was livid. Why hadn't he, the acknowledged authority, been told about the scrolls? It is deeply to be regretted that those who received the earliest information about the find in 1947 and 1948 did not take all possible steps to ensure the proper handling and treatment of the original excavation of the cave, he later wrote. Though an uneasy peace had been restored in Palestine for the time being, no one would tell Harding and de Val the location of the cave, so they rallied their teams and set out to find their own. But there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. There's the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like I said, I wanted to get into just kind of more fun stuff like that, you know. I think we're going to wrap it up right there. If you're an audio listener only, you can find, if you want to put a face to a voice, go ahead and go to YouTube and find Conspiracy Corner Podcast and subscribe there. I also put out random stuff sometimes, like cooking videos, taste test videos, hiking videos, ghost hunting videos, fun stuff like that. Now, if you're a visual subscriber, you can also check us out on Google Podcasts, Breaker, Radio Public, Spotify, and Anchor. Some people like to listen audio only while they're working or cleaning around the house. It saves your phone battery because your phone goes into sleep mode, so kind of helps out a little bit. But please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll leave off right there. If you guys found this episode interesting and intriguing and fun, and you would like to see a part 2, hit me up in the comments and we'll continue the story. But that's it. Y'all have a good day, and thanks for tuning in.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.